So welcome to the WAPPP webinar on airport PPP in Africa. What future can we expect? My name is Jacques Follin. I'm member of the steering committee and chairman of the airport chapter of WAPPP, the World Association of PPP Units and PPP Professionals. It is a global home for public-private partnership professionals. Just give me some time to share with you some webinar technicalities that you may face during the coming 60 minutes. Well, the duration of the webinar will be 1 hour from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock CET, Geneva time, and it will be recorded, so you will have access to this webinar on the YouTube channel of WAPPP, and you will have access also through the WAPPP website. The chat function is activated for organizational matters only. Just please use the Q&A box for any contents, any queries you may have. I will try to respond during the webinar. As the sequence of events is very simple, we'll be introducing the panelists. We'll be presenting a quick overview of the situation about airport PPPs in Africa, and then we'll start the discussion between the panelists. Now, I think that we can start. Well, in most of African countries, airports are more than elsewhere an essential entry points, a gateway to the countries. The needs in terms of developing or renovating airport infrastructures, including bringing them up to international standards, are often critical on the African continent. In this context, the PPP model should be seen as a solution designed to meet those needs. However, a recent study which has been conducted by ACI, Airport Council International, shows that the proportion of passenger traffic held by airports with private sector participation does not exceed 11%, when this share is around 42% at the world level for the rest of the world. So it's very low in Africa. This study also shows that, unfortunately, the average number of bidders for each PPP airport tender does not exceed 2 when it reaches 4 at the worldwide level. So less attractiveness. So what are the reasons for Africa's efficiency in attracting private sector to its airports? Why operators and investors seem to be so cautious vis-à-vis African airport PPP project? Well, I would say let's try to answer this question during this webinar, which will be moderated by myself and by Doreen Karake from the Rwanda Development Board. And I'm very pleased to introduce Doreen. She has 12 years of experience in various areas of law. She has a unique expertise in investment negotiation for both government and private sector, with a particular strength in negotiating infrastructure projects, renewable energy, mining, and health projects. And Doreen is currently leading the government of Rwanda investment negotiation team, a team that includes lawyers, financial experts, and PPP analysts. So, well, Doreen, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacques, for setting the stage for today's webinar on airport PPPs in Africa, which for me is a very critical area of development for PPPs. It is my great honor and pleasure to be co-moderating this session with you and to be joined by such an esteemed group of panelists. Please allow me to introduce our panelists for today, starting with Sophie Pignon. Sophie is a partner leading the Public Law Projects Department of Taylor Wessing in France. Sophie has over 20 years of recognized expertise in public sector contracts, including PPP and issues related to state-owned property. She advises sponsors and governmental authorities in connection with complex contractual arrangements in many sectors, including transportation and energy, in France and internationally, and of course, including Africa. Sophie, it's good to have you here. Next, we have Pierre Pozzo Di Borgo, who is currently Chief Industrial Specialist at IFC Africa Infrastructure Investment Division. In his career, he has accumulated 29 years of experience in the financial, legal, regulatory, environmental, and social due diligence of transport, energy, water, and telecommunications infrastructure projects in Asia, Europe, America, and Africa. In Africa, Pierre has led multidisciplinary teams engaged in airport and airline privatization. In Kenya, Madagascar, Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, Namibia, South Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Malawi, Senegal, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Senegal. It's really good to have you here, Pierre. And then please allow me to introduce Olivier Barrick, who is the Aviation Director of Aegis for Africa. He has been involved in airport public-private partnerships for more than 20 years, including in Abidjan, Tahiti, Cyprus, and Congo-Brazzaville. He is also in charge of starting up and developing the CMA Abidjan, a joint initiative of Aegis and Commerce International to meet the growing demand of African aviation stakeholders for developing aviation professional skills. Olivier is the member of the board of SEGAP and AERCO, Airport du Congo. Good to have you here, Olivier. We then have Homer Ekoto, who is an aviation professional with more than 19 years of experience. As Chief Aviation Officer of the Africa Development Bank, he is responsible for developing and executing the bank's framework to support the aviation sector in Africa. Before joining the bank, Homer worked at the International Civil Aviation Organization, where he ran the technical assistance and airport transport programs for the Western and Central African region. It's an honor to have you, Homer. And then we have Mathieu Peller, who is Chief Operating Officer of Meridiam Africa. As such, he manages the African activities of Meridiam, leading the development, investment, and portfolio activities. Meridiam deployed its first African fund, invested in 13 infrastructure assets, such as several clean energy IPPs and transport concessions, and in particular, the concession for the airports of Antananarivo and Nosy Bay in Madagascar. Meridiam is now deploying its second Africa fund. Mathieu has more than 10 years experience in developing and financing PPPs. And last but not least, we have Kader Hassan, who is a Senior Director at Africa 50 Infrastructure Fund. Kader has recognized expertise in infrastructure development with over 16 years experience, with a solid track record in the implementation, financing, and structuring of infrastructure in North America and Africa. Prior to Africa 50, he was Director of Investments for a Denham Capital platform, Greenwich Partners, leading infrastructure projects in West and Central Africa. It's such an honor to have you with us, Kader, today. So prior to engaging the roundtable, I would like to ask Mr. Curtis Grad, the CEO of our partner Modalis, Airport IR, to make a quick review of the existing and ongoing airport PPP transactions in Africa. Curtis, the floor is yours.
Just 1 second. Okay, if everything's working correctly, you should be seeing the presentation.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Doreen. I want to just take a few minutes to introduce the active and the upcoming PPPs in Africa. And I'll start by saying this isn't an exhaustive list, but through our work with Modalis and Airport IR being our business intelligence website, we've been tracking roughly 100 deals worldwide, including a number in Africa. So we'll start with some of the existing, and we've identified roughly a dozen that are in various stages of implementation and running their course. In Benin, there's a management contract that was signed back in 2018 with ADP, which many of you would be aware of. We understand there's no plans at this point for concession, but it is operating on a management contract. We also have Gabon in Libreville. The the Aegis contract that ran through from 1998 till 2018, that was a 30-year concession. That has since expired. However, it is operating with a company formed with OLAM and local private investors, and it operates under a new concession scheme. We also have Ivory Coast and Abidjan managed under the concession of area, and operators are Aegis, and that runs till 2030. Madagascar is also a fairly new one, and that is managed under a 28-year concession. It runs until 2042, and it's Ravanavia, and the airport is managed through a consortium of Meridium, ADP, Bouygues, and Colas. We also have Afroport working in partnership with the Mauritian government for Mauritania. And that was awarded in 2018, and it includes management and handling activities. Mauritius, the ATOL, which is a joint venture between ADP and AML, that's Airports of Mauritius, runs the airport under a concession that runs to 2024. We also have a number of others that are running currently, including Mayotte, and that runs under a contract with EDIS. And we have in Niger another concession scheme run by the Turkish company Suma. Nigeria, there's a fairly new concession that has been developed with the Delta State government. That was formally handed over to the Asaba Airport Development Company. The consortium includes the First Investment Development Bank and Menzies, and that actually just got started in August of 2021. Olivia, be quite familiar with the work done in the Congo with the concession for 3 airports that have been running under a 25-year concession. That is also including the development, operation, and maintenance contract. And that started in 2009 through a company called Airco, which includes Aegis Avia, Segap, and the Marseille Airport, as well as Aegis Projects. Senegal also has a concession running that was awarded to Fraport and retendered back in 2017, and has now been awarded to a Turkish company of Limak, and again, Suma appears in this consortium as well. And finally, rounding out the existing list, again, not exhaustive, but also Tunisia with Tavwa Airports running these 2 airports for a period running up to 2047. There are a number that are in process, including Burkina Faso. That was awarded back in 2020, earlier in 2021 to Meridium, although with the financial close yet to come. Cape Verde, that was a group of 7 airports that was started concession process prior to the pandemic. It was expected to launch in 2019. However, we understand that Vinci has been reportedly negotiating directly with the government, and looks like that may be in the closing process in the coming months. We also have Guinea, and again, some of our panelists on this call today would be well aware of this this concession. That it was a concession agreement signed in 2020, and with the government of Guinea, and however, with some of the political activities going on currently, the transaction timing is in question. Finally, in Nigeria, we've got the Big Four. They've been running the process for quite some time. We understand as of mid-August, there was an amendment that was issued to extend the period for soliciting qualifications, and that has now been extended to the 25th of October. And reportedly, there's been a bit of a mooted interest in the concessions, which is apparently the reason for the extension. Finally, there's a number of what I call long lead and upcoming opportunities. They're not necessarily in a formal process yet, but they include Angola with a presidential decree that was signed back in 2020, as well as Ghana. There's a number of smaller airports that they would like to develop under a PPP model. Some of the discussions around Accra were sort of front and center roughly a year and a half ago, but that seems to have been firmly refuted by the government, so that does not look to be moving forward. We've also heard some information coming out of Libya in the last year or so that they're readying their airports for concession. but not a lot of detail provided yet. Malawi, with their privatization commission, they've also confirmed back in April of 2021 that they were actively courting private sector. But again, we have not seen any sort of firm processes started. And finally, and very recently, we've heard that Zimbabwe, through its recently formed Airports Company of Zimbabwe, is looking at the possibility of a PPP framework for some of the airports in the country. So Doreen and Jacques, that's the roundup, and I hope that we can have a very good and candid conversation about the future of African airports. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Curtis, for your insightful presentation that really goes to show that Africa needs PPP in the airport sector, and that actually there's a lot of opportunity in that area. Maybe we can move on to having a roundtable. And my first set of questions goes to the airport specialists. And my question is, do you think that there is a need or not for new airport infrastructure or renovation of current infrastructure in Africa? And on that, do you feel that African countries are fully aware of the existence of a real need in terms of this infrastructure that we're talking about? And lastly, do you believe that airport development projects rank high enough in terms of priority in many African countries? Maybe we can start with Pierre, then move on to Romain and Olivier. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Doreen. So I tend to make short answers. So is there a need? Yes. Is there a need for Greenfield Airport? I would tend to debate that the answer is no. Most brownfield airports are underutilized, but are being affected by some excessive peaking demand linked to, in my viewpoint, mismanagement of requests from airline being done both by the civil aviation of the country that are in charge of providing those slots and the airport authority that manage them. So, outside of peaking, we have airports, peaking hours, we have airports usually that are fully deserted. They're basically all those mirrors or museums that are very nice to visit, but not much is going on. And so looking at all of that, I would really argue that first and foremost, African governments and public operators should focus on making more of what they already have, and there's ample space to do so. Whether or not governments are putting airports in the right priorities in terms of investment or policy support, it depends whether or not they have a national airline. I'm going to be blunt on that one. When they have a national carrier, they tend to look at airport much more acutely than when they don't, or when the airport are money-making engine for the treasury, they'll also look at them that way. Very rarely do we see airport being looked at economic development tools. They're more looked at as financial weapons, if I may say so, financial making, producing systems. So that's my answer to your question.
Thanks, Pierre. Romain, do you have any additions to that?
Thank you, Doreen. And first of all, thank you to the WAPPP for inviting the African Development Bank to participate in this important panel. Quickly, whether yes or no there are need for new airports. Well, the answer, it's difficult to give a general answer. One thing though is in 2018, IQ conducted a gap analysis on infrastructure. And this gap analysis revealed the actual situation, the needs of airports, revamping or construction of new airport. And you could actually compare this versus the plans of some of the countries. And you have in some cases, a complete opposition, i.e. some countries planning to build new airport or to expand existing airport, whereas the gap analysis didn't show any such need. Maybe just modernizing, maybe revamping, but not extending or building new airports. So it's really based, in my view, on planning. And really the message for me here is we need proper planning before we engage into any type of infrastructure investment. Now, this also actually addresses the following question about whether they are aware of a real need or not. It's again about planning. If you don't plan, then the triggers can be either political or, but they're definitely not rational. They're not based on, you know, on figures. So they engage into a huge investment in infrastructure without necessarily proper calculation or maybe even dreaming about traffic figures for the future. Now, in terms of whether airport development projects rank high enough in African countries, I think Pierre gave a fairly good answer about whether it usually depends on whether they have an airline or not. But I would say the issue is also about looking at aviation as a system, because putting the emphasis on just airport without looking at, you know, how you provide the air transport services, in my view, is a weakness. So again, this has to be done in a systemic approach. You have to look at the whole air transport system and see how you push it. Infrastructure cannot be regarded alone, because you also have issues with human resources. You can have the best infrastructure, but if you don't have the proper human resources, then you will not make the best use of your infrastructure. Okay.
Thanks, Romain. Olivier, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Doreen, for giving me and Aegis the opportunity to talk and to chat today with the panelists and the audience. Just a detail to complete what Curtis said about Aegis involvement in airport in Africa. So we are both in Abidjan with Aéria and in Congo with Aerco, involved with SEGAP, and SEGAP is a joint subsidiary of Aegis, together with AIM, African infrastructure investors based in South Africa, that took over from Marseille Airport in 2018. It's important because Marseille now has other partnership, and we have good news in terms of PPP. Recent news that Miriam will tell us, I'm sure, later on in the discussion. So to answer the question, I concur to what both Pierre and Romain were saying. What is needed is not infrastructure alone, is air connectivity. And particularly, this is particularly important to opening up the hinterland of Africa. So if we go through the different airport projects, well, how irrespective of the way they are driven or financed, we realize that the main gateways are now under construction. There are projects that are ongoing. What I believe that the future is for regional, more domestic airports in the hinterland of Africa, where the traffic is even smaller than it is in the gateways, and what makes the situation more complicated. So I guess in the course of the discussion, we'll see how this can be addressed through a PPP approach and through properly tailored partnership and properly prepared. But to me, yes, there is more than ever a need for revamped, refurbished, and more efficient infrastructure in Africa. Governments, public authorities are fully aware of that. Sometimes we consider the airport as and it's not typical to Africa, as a very totemic thing. So it has to demonstrate how big, how ambitious the country is. With the COVID, to recover from the COVID, we will need to have more than ever efficient airports that will serve airlines and that will serve the air traffic development, minimizing costs when investing and minimizing costs at operating and maintaining these assets. So that's my contribution to this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier. And I am glad that you have brought up the element of traffic risk, which was actually my follow-up question. So among the major characteristics of airport PPP industry is the traffic risk, is that it's a traffic risk industry. And airport infrastructures are very expensive and require significant revenues to be self-financed. Do you see the instability in air traffic, enhanced recently, obviously, by the COVID crisis, and the relatively small traffic size of a majority of African airports as a hindrance on long-term commitments such as airport concessions in Africa? Olivier?
Yeah, of course, it doesn't help. But I believe that what we've witnessed within our two airport partnership in Côte d'Ivoire and in Congo, compared to the other 15 airports we are partner with, is that the pace of the recovery is much higher than anywhere else. So that's very every month of this year, when looking at the figures of each airport, we reconsidered the forecast for 2021 and for next year. So we are more and more confident in the future after COVID. So there is a quite simple explanation about that. So there is the need to connect is there. And to a certain extent, at the early stage of the crisis, the African countries were less affected, so the regional traffic was still there, and now we see the international traffic recovering. So yes, we are exposed to the uncertainty of the traffic. By essence, aviation is uncertain worldwide. Therefore, we need to have a more thorough assessment of our investment, better planning, as Romain said, to how do you say, to address these more than ever hard times.
Thanks, Olivier. Homer, what are your thoughts on this topic of the traffic element fitting in with PPPs?
Sure, Doreen. I'll have a little bit different perspective on this, in the sense that when you look at a relatively long time scale, the traffic is actually stably, growing, except the crisis that affected the global crisis. And as Olivier was saying, the air transport traffic figures are actually even improving faster and better than what was anticipated. So the traffic risk, although it's there, especially when you talk about projections that can be unrealistic, the risks associated with long-term commitment on concessions, in my view, are related to other factors, and hopefully we'll have opportunity to discuss them later. Now, the issue of small traffic size, I would say, whereas globally, the threshold for concession airports to be profitable is usually about 1 million. I would say in Africa, the situation is a little bit different, in the sense that there is a kind of monopolistic situation that provides more comfort to investors, actually for the transactions to be attractive. And particularly, in most of the airports, you still have also services, typically ground handling, that are also under the purview of the concessionaire. And this actually greatly contributes to making the transaction attractive for the investors. So in this sense, I would say this relatively small traffic size is not always blocking factor for long-term commitment for concessions.
Thanks, Omer. That's interesting. Pierre, do you tend to agree with Olivier, or are you siding with?
Well, I'm forced to agree with Olivier. He's a potential client, so I will certainly not dispute Olivier's statement in front of anyone. But setting aside my natural conflict of interest and putting my frankness, I think we're not worried about traffic from the standpoint that, unfortunately or fortunately, demand is fairly inelastic right now in Africa, because the portion of traffic that is really linked to absolute leisure traffic outside of Morocco, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa is really not there. And so, you don't travel because you feel like it, you travel because you have to right now, mostly in Africa. So when you look at the elasticity of demand in relationship to GDP, you see that Africa is the laggard around the world, meaning the multiple for the world is 1.5, 1.7. Africa is almost 1 to 1. Okay, so in that sense, we're not worried. What we're worried about in a post-COVID era is the exposure of Africa, especially of those smaller airports, to the lack of connectivity and basically attrition of supply, not of demand. And by that, I mean the omnipresence or the quasi-monopoly of some regional routes of one or two airlines that happen to be public and who are being protected from any other type of competition, especially from new airline that could be private. And so what we worry about on the short to medium term is were those companies not able to survive COVID or survive it through a very restrictive approach to their ability to serve those traffic because they're bleeding money and their government are running out of money? Would they be the leanness and the wherewithal of government to open those markets to try to bring other players to replace that missing supply? So that's what worries us. Over the long term, what we would like to see is Africa overperforming and not underperforming compared to its potential by having that kind of real open sky that could drive that kind of new supply and lower prices overall, so that we can get more passenger out of GDP per capita that we get right now.
Thanks, Pierre. These are really exciting views. Maybe let's move away from the airport specialists and maybe hear from an investor's point of view. And this following question really is for Kader and Mathieu to weigh in. The question is, how do you perceive the airport PPP market in Africa? Does it remain a priority? Do you think it remains a priority? Or do other markets other than airports seem more attractive today in Africa? Do you also see any specific difficulties that prevent investors from investing in African airports? Kader?
Thank you, Doreen, and thank you for inviting me and for inviting us, Africa 50, to participate in this. And I'm glad we're looking at the investor perspective, and Pierre had a few things to say that I will join him on, and he's absolutely correct. So from an investor, we like airports. We like airports a lot because airports provide an inherent mitigant to some of the key risks that as investors, we try to mitigate. The first one is when we're looking at airport in most of our markets, say for maybe Morocco, Egypt, South Africa, you're looking at a quasi-monopolistic asset. If people are coming into the country, 90% of people who are coming via air are coming through your facility. So that gives this form of monopoly gives you an insulation vis-a-vis competition or vis-a-vis even traffic, as Romain was saying, if you're looking at it on a long-term basis. What's also important for people to realize is when we look at African airports that are not tourism destination, as Pierre said, the demand is extremely inelastic, which means that you can bank on your traffic being there and you can bank on it increasing over time. And whenever you have an issue that drastically reduces the traffic, it is almost always linked to a force majeure event that you will have protection for under your agreement. Either it's natural force majeure, political force majeure, but you're covered, which means there will be an extension to your concession, especially because our concessions are 10 or 15-year tenors. The other issue for us as investor is we don't like to be exposed to local currency risk. That's one that we try to hedge against, and that's one that's very expensive to mitigate against. Airports inherently have revenues that are dollarized or in hard currency. So we like that as investors, let alone the fact that they're very long and stable. Now, to be brief, the difficulties we have as investors when we're coming in is a term that that a friend of mine described is, he called it a hub session. Every single African market you go to, they have this view, regardless of reality, that the airport should be a hub for the region. And they have this white elephant syndrome. So you're always having as an investor to right-size the investment. I like what Pierre said earlier, which is building a brand new facility 60 kilometers outside the city with the roads doesn't always make sense. The issue these facilities have are a peaking issue. So we just need to do with what we have on a brownfield asset. That has been the difficulty, at least in my experience from an investor, to right-size the investment. So yes, it remains a priority. Other sector, and what you meant by other markets, you meant sectors that we look at it that's very similar, that is just as high of a priority for us is the port sector, which has some of the similarities of airports, but because you're dealing with goods and not so much people and individual, some of the restrictions aren't quite the same. But as an investor, yes, we like airport, we like it a lot for those reasons. Thanks.
good to hear, Kadir. Mathieu, your thoughts, please.
Well, I'll seem during the, I seem that Mathieu is having an issue with his computer. So, well, I would suggest that you go to next question, and then we'll come back to Mathieu.
Yeah, we can move on. So this is still from an investor's perspective. So financing is a key issue in developing PPPs, of course, that's the whole point. The question really is, what are the major difficulties or handicaps to finance successfully African airport PPP projects? And I know Kadir has touched on some of the elements, and not that we need you to repeat those, including local currency risk and all the uncertainties that are involved in Africa. But it would be interesting to hear from the bankers and funders' perspective what other major difficulties and handicaps are in financing these PPPs. Shall we start? Mathieu, you're back. Do you want to start?
Yes, sure. Apologies and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very sorry, but I don't know why the network is not good on my side. If you hear me properly, I can speak.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay, no, I mean, just a few words on your question, and I do hope you all hear me properly. I think what's maybe interesting is to put in perspective investing in airports in Africa against other regions in the world, and why do we believe in Africa that's attractive indeed, to give another perspective. I think what we like with airports in Africa compared to potential other regions, that's the very high developmental impact of these projects in countries where, indeed, as it has been said earlier, that's relatively difficult to travel, and they have really a key enabling role to unlock transport of people and goods. So that's a very important point, and that's why we remain very attracted by these projects on the continent. The second one is the nature of the traffic, which it has been said earlier by Pierre and Kader. I mean, the demand is very focused on the national market. There is very little international travel, and therefore there is a strong correlation with GDP. There is a lower ratio than multiple than with other regions, but there is a stronger correlation.
Okay, well, we'll wait for him to come back. Pierre, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Of difficult obstacles to raise financings, yeah. So beyond the one that Kader has addressed, and that's why if you look at the IFC portfolio, but I'm sure at our colleague at the FDB portfolio and any others, it's heavily tilted for private sector in Africa on port and airport, because they address two key things. One is foreign exchange risk because of hard currency denominated tariff, and the other one is natural monopoly features who tend to, with the tariff, guarantee a certain level of revenue that we can bank on and do our due diligence against. I think the other issues, which are quite important, not as important in other sectors such as railway, for example, is the HR dimension. I've always been struck by the fact that when we are being presented with teasers for investment, there's never a single word about human resources, the quality of human resources or the lack thereof. There's also inherently, when you take a public airport into a private airport, you have to change completely the DNA of the company. And when you inherit 40 years or 50 years of public DNA, changing that may take a generation, or may take, I would say, ruthless yet well-calibrated and respectful ways of sizing down, the staff, and then bringing new blood that has a different perspective, has a commercially oriented mind, and that may take time as well. Then there's the issue of the quality of the regulation, both technical and financial. Would you be in an environment where the regulator is a potent one? We like actually very good regulators, very insightful one, very tough one, because at least they offer a stable platform for dialogue and ultimately inevitable changes of adaptation of the concession contract that will have to take place. And so as lender, we like strong regulators. We don't like weak ones, because weak ones then leave the foray to political folks to actually take the dialogue away from them. And then we enter into discussion that can be far more destabilizing when it comes to the investment environment. And last and not least, of course, all the issue related to legacy, environmental and social issues that we have to deal with that can be of importance, and that usually tend to be underestimated, or when it comes to implementation, private sector usually doesn't want to take them on. They want to take on whatever is for them in a very defined and precise way, but usually it is the role of the government to avail something that is clean and free of any financial and ENS liability. And what we have seen again and again, and I think my colleague Mathieu know what I'm talking about in one of the projects we work together, is there are sometimes legacy issues that, in spite of public commitment to be dealt with swiftly, tend to linger, and I would say pollute the quality of the dialogue and the relationship between the private sector and the public sector, and inherently then pose a risk for their lenders.
Thanks, Pierre. That's very comprehensive. I would ask Homer if you have any other diverging views, this is the opportunity to give it.
I think Pierre has addressed the issues that we all are faced with, and also Kader, but I would like just to highlight 2 points here. Is one, the right sizing of the project. This is something that can really kill a transaction if the project is not right sized. And I've seen many occasions where the African Development Bank actually stepped out of the discussion because we couldn't meet a common ground, because the project wasn't, I mean, you know, we talked about so those white elephants. This is one. And the other issue is about, you know, the structuring of the PPP. And Pierre actually gave all the details, like the legal framework and, you know, all the details of what gets into consideration. I mean, what we consider when we talk about structuring of the PPP. But I'm also talking, when I say structuring, is in some cases we've seen packages of, you know, airports, but this again has to be well thought, because the proper package can be attractive and also can be disruptive for a transaction, because you usually see one gateway with some secondary airports. This is probably the right way to go, because then there's some cross subsidies between the airports, but it has to be thought well. And actually, this is also one of the reasons why the African Development Bank did establish a facility to support, you know, the development of those projects, because success of the PPP actually lies with the proper preparation of the project. Thank you.
Thanks. Jacques, over to you.
Yes. Well, I thank you, Doreen. I would like to start asking you a question. This is the reason why you give me the floor. Countries' legal framework and environment are often seen as a critical element in the success of a PPP. Do you feel that African countries are well equipped to face the complexity of the patterns of public-private partnership, and especially in the world of airports? Doreen, I give you the floor, and then it will be Sophie's turn.
Well, thanks, Jacques. Yes, my simple answer is I think they are getting equipped. I mean, and I think they're very aware. I was reading a World Bank report that was published a couple of years ago that shows that most African countries have some form of a PPP legal framework in place, and only maybe 10 countries have zero. So obviously there is a consensus of the importance of legal framework and predictability. And I think Pierre touched on this, that investors want predictability. They want to know what they're getting, that the concessions are not going to be taken away, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a consensus that we need framework. Most countries have put in the work. But the question is whether PPPs go through that process. And unfortunately, they don't usually go through the whole process, because when you have a very regulated element, then we usually want to take shortcuts because it's just quicker to do that way. But African governments are getting more equipped. I'll give you an example of my own country, Rwanda, where we do have a team in place that negotiates PPPs on behalf of government. And with time, it is a very new team. I think it's maybe 9-10 years old. The department is 9 or 10 years old. And so as we practice, obviously we make mistakes along the way, but we're getting equipped as we go. Thanks. Sophie?
Sophie?
Yes, thanks, Jack, to invite me. Effectively, important efforts have been made for the past 10 years to adopt specific legal framework for PPPs. But even if the legislative framework are quite stable today for PPPs to emerge, I think that today it's quite difficult to handle because there's no historical practice of this concept. And sometimes it's not well adjusted to the local context. In fact, most of the time there are lack of experience in past projects and a lack of combined expertise in financial and legal aspects. Sometimes for public entities, I think it's difficult to understand the notion of bankability of the contract. For example, it's difficult to negotiate some provision relating to the exoneration of liability for legitimate reason, or the necessity to indemnify at least as much as the amount of the debt, even in case of termination for breach. So it's why I think it's very important to continue to reinforce the capacity buildings, and maybe to start the implementation of a PPP with a leading project in order to gain experience and to get confident in PPPs.
Well, thank you very much, Sophie. I have another question to ask you, is that what do you believe are some of the government fears when entering into these airport PPPs? And I would also ask a complementary question. I mean, government tend to prefer a build, finance, transfer model, but are not keen on getting into long-term agreements for the operation of the airports. Considering the required transition, securing debt, as well as the payback of debt, what do you think is the best model for this type of airport agreement? It's a general question, but it's a key question in the world of PPP. Let's start with Sophie. I mean, you had the floor, keep the floor.
Thanks, Jack. Maybe it's a personal point of view, but I think often the fact that the operation of the infrastructure is not transferred to the private contractor is related to the staff working at the airport and the potential difficulties of transfer of the staff. So I think it's a key issue for the operation of the airport. But however, the best model, of course, is to have a global contract, including the operation of the airport. It gives more incentives to the private sector, a better management of the interfaces, and a bigger risk transfer to the private sector. So I think if we want to include the operation of the airport in the global contract, we need to have a specific attention to the staff and to the subcontracts granted to local companies, because today is a key issue for states.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Mathieu, if your line is better, I mean, maybe you could try to answer.
Yes, sure. Hopefully that's better. I mean, on this point, I believe the biggest misunderstanding which has to be dealt with the governments is the alignment of interest and the commitment over the long term from the concessionaire to invest in additional capacity. I think most of the time that's because there is a concern from the government that the concessionaire will not offer sufficient capacity, that will sit on a rent, on a monopolistic situation, and not commit additional equity financing and therefore capacity. So I think as soon as we manage to reach a common understanding and set up in the contract the right KPIs, commitment, and as well sharing mechanism and alignment of interest, I think that's the winning formula, and that's how we can convince governments to do a rather a concession, a PPP, than an EPC plus finance. So that's what we I believe we managed to do in the airports we manage in Madagascar, and that's what we managed to convince of the Burkinabe's government recently, because we had the pleasure to sign the concession agreement of the new Ouagadougou airport on Tuesday, together with Aéroport de Marseille as airport operator.
Well, very sorry. So, well, let's move, Kader. You may have a better line, so I mean, we'll come back to Mathieu afterwards.
Hopefully, I heard what's been said. I heard what Mathieu said. I do agree with him, but I think that's my personal view is that is secondary. I think there are two bigger issues that we didn't address. The first one is that let's not forget that we're dealing with a regulated and a very strategic asset. That is the first one. You're touching on something that is sovereignty at stake. There is a lot of confusion when we're talking to these governments about PPP. They're thinking that they're farming out their airport, which is a strategic asset, to a private. And there's border control, there's civil aviation authority. So there's a lot of confusion about where you put the marker. And what does that mean? Does that mean my custom agents are going to be private sector folks that you're going to come in? Does that mean the policemen who are validating immigrants entry and exit? Who's doing that work? So there's a lot of discussion and education that happens to make sure that the government understands that getting a private party into your airport does not mean that you're losing sovereign control over all the areas that you're supposed to regulate. That's the first one. We need to get over that hurdle. The second one is a lot more basic. It's money. Today in these airports, there's a lot of money that's coming into the government. All of the taxes, the charges, the staff, the personnel. So where's that money going to go? So there needs to be a clear analysis to the government by saying, look, this is what you're going to get as a concession fee, entry fee. When we operate this, if you come into the concessionaire as a shareholder, this is what your dividend may equate to. And they will need to do a cost benefit analysis of saying, well, I get X million dollars a year. But now when the concession takes place, I'm going to have a new airport, but this X million dollars a year will become Y million dollars. And I make that analysis. But we need to address these two things up front and make sure they're comfortable. Otherwise, it'll be very, very tricky to get them to move forward. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Kader. Olivier?
Yes, I don't know if I can tell it better than what Kader said, because I fully concur. It's a matter of sovereignty, and from experience, we realize how complicated in the perception of the government and of the staff. So there are two things that Sophie raised as well: is the social issue, the risk of staff transfer, and the perception of the reluctancy of the staff. And I'm sure Mathieu, if he hears us, still knows what we are talking about in Doncin, in Burkina. So each time the PPP reach maturity, staff is rising because there are many interests. There is money at stake. There is arrangement at stake, which are not all disclosed. So and that's not typical to Africa as well. So to answer what the best model is, I don't know. Of course, if we have the full scope of activities with the management, then our capability as an investor and manager is much better to impact and to get the result and to pay back the investment, to pay the government the concession fee. So that's obviously the ideal model. But we can have an incremental and progressive way as well. This can work. We are as an operator, as a partner, we're open to that. But what I get from a common experience we had with Curtis in Cyprus is that the most important is that there is no loser in the deal. And sometimes the grantors are preparing with advisors on what will be given to the private sector. And even the word given, the word takeover, translates what they have in mind. So you take something from an existing staff, you assume that what was done before was not good enough. So then you need to have the private, sometimes foreign private sector, most often coming in to take over and to change things. So without saying it, sometimes you finger point what was wrongly done before. So it's a win-win, and this is exactly what it means. The public authority, the public operator that will hand over to the new company with this new mindset, with new setup, will have to consider it as a progress for the sake of the whole aviation industry in the country. And this is sometimes, and even very often, neglected. So you just cut an arm, you have less money, and you feel less considered because you, as a civil servant, feel how do you say, abandoned from the project. So it has to be a positive things for the regulator, for the body that will be established and that will supervise how the concessionaire, how the private partner will meet its commitments.
Well, thank you very much, Olivier. Well, we are getting to the end of the webinar, and I'd like to give Doreen the floor to ask the last question. Doreen.
Thanks, Jack. So I do have a last couple of questions to just bring this to a close. And I know we've been heavy on private sector and funders and you know what they would like to see. But maybe for a moment, if we can put ourselves in the government's shoes. And my question to you is, and to all the panelists, is what are the elements that you think would make governments more excited to involve private sector in airport infrastructure? And what do you think should be the priorities and initiatives to be implemented to sustainably develop and promote the concept of PPPs in the airport industry in Africa for it to be beneficial to the African continent? Maybe you can start with Sophie.
Yes, thanks, Doreen. There are so many elements, but maybe PPP contracts allow state-of-the-art infrastructure, always in line with international standards, because the operator has the incentive to maintain it in good condition. So I think it's a key point to have this infrastructure maintained in good condition during this long-term contract.
Thanks, Sophie. Pierre, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, sorry. To me, it's the question is, first of all, in the government, who do we educate about an airport PPP? Because you know, I remember a country where in 3 years I had 7 ministers of aviation. So you know, if you educate someone who's gone after 3 months, it's kind of a waste. So at the administrative level, below the minister level, who are the people who need the influencers who need to be educated, and how do we bring them to actual concessions of airports in Africa? We don't have to go beyond Africa and show them the difference between what's at home in public and what's private. I mean, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there are, you know, all of these things, and how we not teach them because it's you know, it's basically pedantic and to say that, but how we share with them why we think they should have an economic view of airports and not purely a financial one. And when they do that, then they can realize the benefit of private sector that goes way beyond just you know, giving more money, but the ability of the airport operator to go see airlines that they have through their worldwide network to bring them to service the country or to be interested in opening routes. It's all about connectivity, and that's what the private sector, besides quality of service, accountability, transparency, and everything that goes with it, has really an edge over public operators who tend to be, you know, in country with limited view of the rest of the world because they already have enough to deal with within their own premises.
Thanks, Pierre. So you're talking about a mindset change, basically. Olivier?
Yes, quickly as the time is flying, but I believe what is absolutely key is to take time and to promote the fact that we need to take time when structuring and when preparing a PPP. From our end, as an investor and a private operator, it's a huge amount of money to run for a competition for a PPP. It needs long studies, a lot of due diligences. So the government should be properly advised, and their advisors should be subsidized so that they can prepare and structure the call for tender or the negotiation in the proper way. And over and above that, I believe that, and that's what Romain was mentioning, that's there is an aviation ecosystem and an air transport ecosystem that has to be understood and decided. So we try to promote with our consultant side of Aegis to promote the development of civil aviation master plans, which encompass more than the airport infrastructure, more than the air traffic management services, more than the airline, but all together, the human resources. Romain was stressing as well how important the human resources are. If you want to change the way you operate, you need to train people to supervise. So you will have different skills to develop. So forcing countries to have a sound, comprehensive airport master plan is a must to favor the proper ground for developing airport PPPs in Africa.
Thanks. Kader, your last comment, I know you have to run.
Yes, so I'll be very brief. So the first one, and it's already been said, take your time. As investors, we need to take time, make sure that we're not rushing the government and they know what they're doing. Two, Olivier said it, they need to have proper counsel and be advised properly. Three, change the paradigm. It is not about what they give us as private sector. It's not private sector that takes. Is what do you as government get as a result of private sector investment and involvement? We need to always put that forward. They are getting a facility and infrastructure that's state of the art, so we need to put those up front. And four, success breeds success. When we're coming to them, it's always better when you're coming to a government the second time around, showing them that your participation in the airport in another market, another jurisdiction has yielded positive returns for the government on an economic term. They will be more amenable to considering doing business with you. Those are my final thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kader. Romain, you get to wrap it up.
Thanks, Doreen. Most of the items, I mean, the ideas have been clearly shared with the other panelists. Just one thing about planning. Olivier mentioned the planning. And in planning, I would also say something that, I mean, two aspects that have to be properly considered. One is the level of cash demand, because that's also where the government will realize that public funding cannot necessarily cover the whole needs in terms of financing. This is one. And the other aspect is also not just looking at the national context, but also looking, at the regional and even continental context, because this also addresses what Kader was mentioning earlier about having a hub in each and every country. Having a regional and even continental view brings this perspective, and also factors in the fact that you can't have a hub in every and any country in the continent. Thank you.
Thanks, Romain. We are running out of time, but I would maybe go to the open questions and ask a couple and then find a way to answer the others online. One of the questions that came through are, how do investors mitigate the political risk when it comes to concessions in politically unstable African countries? Sophie, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, maybe to draft good contract. It could be a start, because in the contract you mitigate the risk. So maybe it's a first start is to protect the investors and the operator of this risk. I think it's a good start.
Thanks. And I think there are companies that give political risk insurance. I guess you could bring them on board as well. A question would be, I would be interested in the panel's view on as to how African airports can increase their non-commercial revenues. Pierre, do you want to weigh in that?
Yes, that's the $10,000 question, obviously, because it's well known that African airports are laggard when it comes to commercial revenue, whereby they represent 10–20% of total revenue, whereas in the rest of the world, they are 50% and sometimes more. I think commercialization of airport premises is important, but also the skills with which the commercial approach is being done is essential. I mean, we want, in some ways, that's where private sector is essential, because they have an understanding of what their customer are looking for, rather than the powers to be locally wants to have access to a captive market and put their duty-free shop here and there. So the way to do it is really to look at example, ensure that the type of services that are being provided are tailored to what your travelers are doing. When you have non-tourist travelers trying to sell to the locals or people who are from the diaspora, tokens of the country is not going to work very well. So it's really about know-how, knowledge, and bringing external expertise when it's needed, and having really people at the commercial department that are tuned and to the needs of their customers. And quite often we see designs and proposal for duty-free shops and other things that are being done purely on, I've seen that somewhere else as I've done. They've never done a customer survey in their life to know whether or not that will respond to a need. So, and then you have, of course, to create needs when you know that you're a hub system, you have people staying for hours and hours. So will they be shopping for 3 hours, or will they be dining for 2 hours and shopping for 1? So all of that is linked to a knowledge of your customer base, and that takes time, that takes expertise, and private sector can bring that expertise in no time when they are being selected, when they are truly international operators, because they have that knowledge.
That's a great answer, Pierre. I will ask maybe one last question, which is, in the aftermath of ACI and EAT conflict over increasing airport charges, are those with current concessions looking to increase airport charges to recover from the COVID crisis? Or will they create incentive schemes to support the airlines to recover traffic? Which option is best to ensure long-term return on investment and the fastest recovery? Olivier, you seem amused by that question. Do you want to weigh in?
No, it's the old question. No, both, and each situation is different. What we are particularly we pay attention to in each airport we partner with is our competitiveness. The level of our fees and the cost of the touchdown compared to the neighboring airport. So we are extremely focused on our costs toward airlines. And as Pierre said, there will be obviously a drift from the revenues collected from airline to the land-side revenues on airports, and we will have to be clever and agile in the way, and grantors in PPPs will have to probably trust the private sector more to give more land to develop, because they are interesting and nice project to develop around the airport city concept, which is another good way to partner with other private investors which are not airport operators. So to get more revenues from land side, from the land development, and that will generate more interest, more competition, for more competitivity for your airport. So that's the reason why I was finding it's both have to be done, but the investment are there. For the future, we'll have to carefully design our new investment to scale them, to phase them in a proper way, and keep the dialogue with airlines.
Thank you, Olivier. Unfortunately, the questions are so many. We will find a way to answer them. Please reach out to us directly. And thank you all for your insights. I invite Jack to close this session.
Well, thank you very much, Doreen. I have been personally impressed by the number of professionals who have joined the WAPPP webinar. I mean, we were between 100 and 150 all the time. And we thank you all to have taken the time to participate and take the time for asking interesting questions and having the panelists answering this question. I mean, I think you all did a great job, participants and panelists. So thank you very much to you all. We will publish shortly a short summary of today's webinar on the WAPPP website. It's www.wapp.org. And the webinar has been recorded and it will be soon available on YouTube and LinkedIn. Thank you all, and you did a very good job. Thank you.